Scott. All right, today I want to continue our discussion from last week. We were kind of looking at the decline of the power of the papacy. The Pope, not his, I wouldn't say he didn't have any power at all by the time Martin Luther. He still was a powerful man, a powerful position, but not like he had been at one time. As we mentioned last Sunday, if you said, well, does the Pope still have power today? Yeah, he still has a lot of influence, but not like he once did. I think it's definitely a different thing than it once was in that respect. So we'll look at some of that, and my goal is to finish some of the history part today and get back into some of the scriptures related to our topic. I told you that I believe one of the things that really began weakening his power, or maybe we should say the confidence in the Pope, was the Crusades. And so the first crusade, as we mentioned, I think we were finishing as the bell caught us. Again, the background of that, Alexius Comnenus, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, had been attacked. They'd lost a lot of their territory from the Turks. And the Turks had won a big battle. The Battle of Mansa occurred in the year 1071 and was threatening Constantinople and taking more of what's now Turkey. And so Alexius Comnenus appeals to the Pope for help. Can you send some armies to help us? Which again, as I said, is kind of interesting in that the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church had officially split in 1054, just a few years before, but the Pope does. And so the Pope says, all right, we're gonna send you kings on a crusade. Anybody that's killed, you're immediately going to be saved. You're immediately going to be in paradise. So it said that of all the crusades, this was the most successful from the viewpoint of the Crusaders. So they did retake Turkey and give that back to all that land back to Constantinople. They did enter the Holy Land and they recaptured Jerusalem. So it was the most successful of all of the crusades. About 1099, that land is back under the control of the Byzantine Empire. The second crusade was a complete disaster. In 1144, so this is, what's the math on that? 45 years after that. So the Muslims begin to kind of regroup, and they're determined that, okay, they're going to drive these crusaders out of these territories. So in the year 1144, the Muslims recaptured Edessa from Crusader nobles. And this is a city, I don't remember how many miles, 100 miles or so north of Jerusalem, approximately. So the second crusade was a response to the loss of Edessa. We're going to recapture that for Christendom, for the Christian empires. It lasted from 1147 to 1149. At the Pope's direction, this Pope was Pope Eugene III. Bernard of Clairvaux preached the need for Europeans to battle once more. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany led this crusade. And it's interesting, the mother of, a side note, the mother of Richard the Lionhearted and King John of England was married to Louis VII at this time. So she was the Queen of France. She later married the King of England, so she was the Queen of both France and England, as a side note. But instead of going to Edessa, that was the focal point, that's what they were trying to recapture, they went somewhere completely different. The German army was defeated before it even reached the Holy Land. I put that in quotes. The French army of Louis VII was ambushed by the Turks in Asia Minor, but did manage to reach Damascus and laid siege to that city. Again, that wasn't even the focal point, but that's where they wound up in Damascus. King Baldwin III had convinced these armies to go to Damascus rather than Edessa. The siege failed, and the armies retreated on July 29, 1148. Complete disaster, wasn't effective at all. The Pope says go, they went, they didn't win. The third crusade, you almost consider it a draw. They didn't accomplish everything they wanted to, but it wasn't a complete disaster. By this time, I don't remember what all I got written down here, but long story short, Jerusalem had fallen to the Muslims in about 1187. So it was under the control of the Crusaders for less than 100 years. And so the third crusade in response to that, we're going to go recapture Jerusalem. So sometimes this crusade is called the Crusade of the Kings. So again, at the Pope's direction, the King of England, the King of Germany, the King of France, I think it was, they all marched toward Jerusalem to recapture it. Well, on the way, the King of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, he drowns. He's drowned crossing a river or something like that. So he doesn't make it. His army retreats. The others, they helped him, did a little bit. So basically, it wound up being just England that was involved in this crusade toward Jerusalem. They never reached it. A guy named Saladin, and I saw a documentary on this several years ago. Saladin gets a lot of credit as the Muslim leader, fighting very bravely. Richard fighting very bravely, both sides. So pretty fierce battle. But basically, they reached a peace agreement. They didn't retake Jerusalem, but Saladin gave them rights to go back on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and this sort of thing, and recapture some of territory that they had lost. But again, the Pope says go. They didn't succeed at the thing that they were supposed to, which was to win in this area. The Fourth Crusade, I think I mentioned y'all in passing. Again, a complete disaster. Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III. As we mentioned, a lot of people consider him the most powerful of all these popes. This kind of the zenith, the apex of papal power. Again, in his direction, Crusaders left Venice, Italy in October 1202. The following year, a Byzantine prince asked assistance from Crusaders to restore his deposed father, Isaac II Angelos, to the throne, the Byzantine throne. Now, again, they're supposed to be fighting to help the Byzantines, but one of the Byzantine guys says, hey, y'all go help my father get back on his throne. So instead of going to the Holy Land, they go and attack instead Constantinople itself. So offered them money to help. Most of the Crusaders diverted their route from Jerusalem to Constantinople. They actually took the city of Constantinople on April 12th, 1204. The Crusaders ransacked Constantinople, and the empire was never the same. Constantinople held on for a couple more centuries, but they would eventually fall themselves to the Turks in 1453, May 29th, 1453. And at that point, Constantinople was changed to Istanbul. So it's now Istanbul, Turkey, which has now been a Muslim city ever since. But this Fourth Crusade is part of the reason why that later happened to them. So some of the details of that, rather shocking, people fighting under the sign of the cross, some things that they did, some of their atrocities. The Latin soldiery subjected the greatest city in Europe, Constantinople, to an indescribable sack. For 3 days they murdered, raped, looted, and destroyed on a scale which even the ancient Vandals and Goths would have found unbelievable. Constantinople had become a veritable museum of ancient and Byzantine art, an emporium of such incredible wealth that the Latins were astounded at the riches they found. Though the Venetians had appreciation for the art which they discovered, they were themselves semi-Byzantines and saved much of it. The French and others destroyed indiscriminately, halting to refresh themselves with wine, violating the monks, and murdering Orthodox clerics. And so this is what they did under the sign of the cross in the Fourth Crusade at the Pope's direction. Now, he didn't, of course, direct them to do all the evil that they did, but that's what they wound up doing. And so I'm going to skip through the rest of that. But as I say, Constantinople never recovered from this event that occurred. And there are other crusades too. So I think there wound up being like 8 or 9 crusades. Again, none of them were very successful. All fought at the direction of the Pope. Not very successful. So again, my point that I'm trying to make is, probably not making it very well, but here's a guy saying, I'm the vicar of Christ. I'm God's representative on earth. I'm telling him to go fight, go take this land, and it wasn't successful. So it created a lot of doubt in people's mind. Maybe he's not what he claims to be. Another thing that is occurring, we talked a little bit about the French monarchy and the Roman Church. The French are becoming more and more independent at this time. So while they still had ties to the Catholic Church, they're distancing themselves a little bit to kind of become their own man. So the Roman Church was a rival of the Capetian rulers. The Capetian rulers, a guy named Hugh Capet, I believe it was, became the king of France in around 987 AD. And that's considered the beginning of modern France at this time. The Roman Church had played an important role in France dating back to the days of Clovis in 498, as well as the reigns of Pepin the Short and Charlemagne. However, the French monarchy became more assertive during these years. And again, here's another event that occurs just before the time of Wycliffe that I think gave Wycliffe an opportunity in England. King Philip the Fair of France, who ruled from 1285 to 1314, clashed with the Pope over whether clergy should be subject to trial in ordinary courts of law. So again, the Pope had already said, well, we are going to name who the clergy is, but he's also saying if clergy get in trouble, they'll be tried in papal courts, not in national courts or federal courts, state courts. And so they locked horns over that. More controversial, Philip levied 50% taxes of the French clergy's annual income. So it's actually, he has the nerve to tax these priests and church leaders there in France. That, as you can imagine, didn't make the Pope very happy either. So in 1296, Pope Boniface VIII reacted predictably by threatening to excommunicate anyone who exacted such taxes, as well as any clergyman who paid them without the Pope's approval. So the Pope says, y'all can't charge my people taxes, and my people, you can't pay the taxes. All right, so that's, again, pretty defiant of what the king had said to do. So Philip responded by forbidding any gold to be exported to Rome. Now, remember, we mentioned a case with the Holy Roman Empire under Henry IV, who reigned in the Holy Roman Empire from 1056 to 1106, that they had a disagreement, argument, and basically Henry backed down and was beating on the Pope's door in the snow in his bare feet, begging for forgiveness. In this case, it went Philip's way. So Boniface replied by issuing a bull, and this is an official decree by the Pope, was what they called a bull.
Where a bunch of bull come from?
I think that's where that comes from. I think that's where that comes from. In the bull, the Pope claimed that all spiritual and temporal authority belonged to the Pope, and that no one could be saved without absolute submission to the Pope. Things they've said already, as y'all have seen throughout history. Philip responded by sending men to Rome to arrest the Pope. It's a pretty strong statement. In 1305, with Philip's influence, a French archbishop became Pope Clement V. The papal court was moved from Rome to Avignon in France. The Pope and the cardinals came under the control of the French monarchy, and all the popes from 1305 until 1378 were French clergymen. This period is referred to by the Catholic Church as the beginning of their Babylonian captivity. So the capital of the Catholic Church moved from Rome to France for about a 73-year period. Similar to the 70-year Babylonian captivity is where that name comes from, why they call it this. So that's what it's called in the Catholic Church. The Roman Church still maintained an important social status in France and wielded much influence. But again, it shows you that there's kings and others beginning to have the nerve to stand up to papal authority and take a stand against some of those things. And shortly after this, another event that weakened the power of the papacy is something called the Great Schism. Pope Gregory XI returned the papal throne to Rome in 1378. So again, it was 73 years in France, and then it was moved back to Rome. After his death, Gregory was succeeded by an Italian Pope Urban VI. Urban VI began to demonstrate a tyrannical attitude, and a group of cardinals voided his election. So some of his own people kind of turned against him and his rule. With French support, they elected another pope, Clement VII, who lived in Avignon, again in France. This division between the rival popes and cardinals of Rome and Avignon is called the Great Schism. It was not fully resolved until the year 1459. So if you visualize this, in the Catholic Church, you got two popes at the same time, one in Rome and one in France. So who's in charge? So again, this kind of, again, still a very powerful institution, but if you call it maybe a chink in the armor, as you will, again, opened up opportunities for some to take more of a stand. Here's a quote. The papacy reasserted some of its power in later years, but the breach had been made in Rome's tyranny, for it was during the time of the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism that the forerunners of the Reformation began to challenge the claims of the papacy with the truths of the Bible. And so it was during this period where you see somebody like John Wycliffe, you see a guy like John Huss begin to preach and speak out, Jerome Savonali, others like that are speaking out against some things that are going on. The Bible had been chained to the pulpit. We talked about that a while back. And most people did not know that what they were doing was not scriptural because they could not study it for themselves. We can. And I mentioned last week, and Brother Henry was talking to me after class Sunday. I feel terrible for these individuals. I mean, I really do. I feel sorry for them. They didn't know any better. I mean, they didn't have any access to the Bible. And you think about what a great blessing it is for you and I tell this to my students at school all the time. Again, I can't speak for you, but I take for granted that I can open up this book anytime I want to and study and learn from it. The people back then couldn't. They didn't have access to it. Either they couldn't read, or it was in the Latin language, or they weren't allowed to own a Bible. The Roman Church elevated the writings of early church leaders, the decisions of councils, and declarations of popes as having equal standing with the Bible. Dad alluded to that Wednesday night. So again, they saw these modern individuals, popes and so forth, having as much authority as the apostles. So the things that popes are saying in these days, they felt like were just as binding as the things that Peter and Paul and others had said. The Bible was relegated to second fiddle. The people, again, did not have access to the Bible in their own language. The Latin Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible that had been translated in the year 405 by Jerome, was about the only version of the Bible available in the Middle Ages. Few ordinary citizens could read Latin and thus did not know any better and had to rely on religious leaders to tell them what God would have them to do. Again, they couldn't study it for themselves like you and I can. A guy named Peter Waldo was a wealthy merchant in Lyons, France. He tried to make the Bible available to Frenchmen. His followers were called Waldenesians. They struggled to get the scriptures into as many hands as possible and adopted the slogan, "The Word of God speaks, and we ought to obey it." Waldo was excommunicated by the Pope in 1184, and he and his followers were severely persecuted. Waldenesians survived into the 1500s, living in the Alps and other places in Europe. So, again, I don't know what all the Waldenesians taught, but they made an attempt to try to get back to the Bible and try to share that with others as much as they could. Another such group was called the Petrobutians, who were named for Peter Bruus. He was a Roman Catholic priest in the early 1100s. He read the Bible for himself, left the Roman Church, and preached in southern France for 20 years. He was burned at the stake as a heretic. That's how they felt about what he was saying. The Council of Toulouse of 1229 forbid anyone except clergy to possess a copy of the Bible, with the exception of the Psalms and lessons contained in the breviary, the service and worship book of the church. The Roman Church did not want members reading the scriptures so that members would not discover the truth of how far the church had strayed from the Bible. The few who did have copies of the Bible had to accept the church's official interpretation of it. You can't question it. And so John Wycliffe in England kind of did what Peter Waldo did and Peter Bruus did in trying to get the Bible into the hands of the English people. And I'll talk more about him another time. I'm going to skip through some of this today and hit it again. John Huss is another early reformer who died in 1415. He was put to death in 1415 for things he was saying, teaching against the Pope and Catholicism. Jerome Savernali was another who was preaching some things against what the Pope was saying. We need to go back to the Bible. He was put to death again for his beliefs and teachings. And we'll hit those a little bit more in the next section that we'll get to. All right. Again, just hitting a couple of things real quick. In Spain, we talk about France having a very close tie to the papacy. Spain eventually did too. Now, they were, I think I mentioned this the other day, the Muslims, the Moors as they were called, had crossed Africa into Spain in the year 711 and had conquered Spain for Islam. And there were parts of Spain that were Islamic until the year 1492, the same year Columbus sailed and discovered the New World. But they had, in Spain, they had what they called the Reconquista. So in the year, around the years 1000 and 1100, they began pushing the Muslims back a little bit during that time, and eventually were able to drive them out. But Ferdinand and Isabella were the rulers, again, as y'all know, the ones that were rulers when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So Ferdinand and Isabella spread Romanism in an effort to wipe out Islamic beliefs in Spain and to further unify the country. Again, they just defeated the Islamic individuals, and so they didn't want any divergent thinking of any type. So they were strongly opposed to any Reformation movements, what Martin Luther did, so forth. Basically, they shut the door on any of that going on in their country. They began the infamous Spanish Inquisition to root up and destroy all heretics in Spain. Thousands of Moors, Jews, and non-Romanist Christians who refused to accept Romanism faced torture, imprisonment, exile, or death. The first Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition was Tomas de Torquemada. His name became synonymous with cruelty and torture. As the modern age began, Spain's power as a nation grew considerably, fueling her ambition to rule the world in the name of the Roman Church. Spain's monarchy was as powerful and absolute as France's and was soon involved in the politics of every nation and kingdom in Europe. And so what you'll see during this time, when the Spanish explorers come to the New World, to South America, North America, they're bringing Catholicism with them. We were talking about this in our world geography class with our students a couple years ago. If you look today, even in the Latin American countries, they say that 80% of that continent is Catholic today. And that's because of these Spanish roots that they had, these Spanish explorers bringing Catholicism with them, and that's still a very strong influence in those areas. Now, we're going to discuss more, like I said, in a future lesson about the Reformation. I won't get in a lot of detail, but just look for just a second at some of the Catholic reaction to the Counter-Reformation, or what they call the Counter-Reformation, their reaction to the Reformation. So one of the things that, again, Luther talked about a lot of things. He disagreed with their teachings and doctrines, and we would agree with a lot of what Luther said. You say, what was the response of the Catholic Church? Basically changed no doctrine from what I can tell. And what they try to do is kind of clean up, their lifestyles and this sort of thing. Luther was really disenchanted with how the Catholic leaders lived their lives, not living very godly lives, to put it mildly. So they tried to kind of clean up that, is kind of the change that they tried to make. The Protestant Reformation so shook the Roman Church that the Pope responded with a Counter-Reformation. This movement attempted to produce certain changes within the Roman Church, mostly in the morals of the clergy. So again, not really any doctrinal changes I could see, just we're going to live better and do better. The main objective was to prevent more Catholics from leaving, defecting, if you will, to the Protestants, and to try to force as many Protestants back into the Catholic fold. The Counter-Reformation breathed new life in the Inquisition. Throughout Europe, especially in Italy and Spain, the Inquisition used torture and terror to obtain confessions of heresy from its Protestant victims. The Inquisition virtually destroyed Protestantism in Spain and halted its growth in many other nations. And like I said, the Reformation never took root to any degree at all in Spain because of these efforts there in their country. The Pope issued something called the Index of Books. And this is a list issued by the Pope of books which Roman Catholics were forbidden to read. So a lot of the literature, the things that Luther was writing, that Calvin was writing, they're forbidden from reading any of that material. The Pope issued this index to protect his domain. Included from the list, some of the writings were Protestant writings, non-Latin vernacular versions of the Bible, and other works. Most of the great books written during the post-Reformation period eventually made this list. So again, the Pope is one of those things that kind of the cat has got out of the bag to some degree, but he's trying to do damage control, I guess you might say, during this time. Now, again, talking about the influence of the popes and how blindly people followed some of these teachings. The Jesuits are an interesting group. I'll share this with you real quick here. While recuperating from battle wounds in the year 1521, 4 years after Martin Luther began to try to break away from Catholicism, a Spanish soldier named Ignatius Loyola read about the life of Christ and the lives of pious Roman saints. He went to a shrine consecrated to the Virgin Mary and confessed his sins for 3 days. Loyola determined to dedicate the rest of his life to obedient service to the Roman Church and the Pope. In 1540, the Pope gave Loyola and some of his companions approval to begin a new religious organization called the Society of Jesus, or later called the Jesuits. In 1541, the society had only 10 members. By Loyola's death 15 years later in 1556, there were 1,500 Jesuits who were members of this organization. Now, how avid were they in following the Pope? Well, this illustrates something that Loyola said. The Jesuits became the spiritual arm for the Counter-Reformation. You'd almost say like the police of Catholicism is what they became at this time. The goal of the Jesuits was to form a group of men absolutely dedicated to the Pope and the Roman Church. Loyola, if I can say it, stated, and this is sad to me, but this is what he said. If the church shall have defined anything to be black, which to our eyes appears to be white, we ought in like manner to pronounce it to be black. If you can call that blindly following somebody. If the Pope says, if he were to look at this wall and say, that wall is black, and no, it's not, I'll go along with the Pope and say, okay, Pope is black. That's just, I don't know, it's just hard for me to wrap my mind around that type of just blindly following somebody. It's sad to me. The motto of the Jesuits became, the end justifies the means. Like in our society today, we call that pragmatism. But doesn't matter how we achieve those ends, we can do some things that's contrary to the Scripture, as long as it works out well in the end. That was one of their mottos. They became very active in spreading Romanism and often resorted to any method necessary to extend the power of the Roman Church. Another prominent meeting they had during this time was the Council of Trent, which actually met for several years, and they concluded their meetings in 1563. Rome made its strongest stand against the Protestants at the Council of Trent. The Pope called this meeting in 1545 and met for several sessions until 1563. And in this, again, not changing any doctrine, anything that we're teaching. They reaffirmed one Roman doctrine after another while denying the teachings of the Reformation, even if they came directly from the Bible. If something read something right out of the Bible, this contradicts what y'all are teaching, we're not changing it. We're not changing what we're doing. And again, to me, that's just sad. All right, here's one of the things that the Pope said. It said, if anyone saith that justifying grace and none other than confidence in God's mercy, which remits sins for Christ's sake, or that by such confidence alone a man is justified, let him be anathema or accursed. And so again, he's talking about some things that Martin Luther was saying, which again, we're going to try to hit that at a future time. Now, Philip II, Philip II is kind of a unique individual. He was the king of Spain, but it kind of simultaneously, he was the king of the Holy Roman Empire, that era of this modern-day Germany, and eventually gained control of Portugal too. Some people in history say that he controlled more of Earth's surface than any of the human being in history. I guess we could say post-flood anyway. Vast empire. If you look at the empire that he, and again, talking about all of, basically all of North and South America, that had to huge territory that he held. Let me read real quick. In addition to ruling Spain, Philip gained control of Portugal in 1580, which in turn gave him control of all Portuguese holdings in Asia and South America. Because of constant conflict with France, England, the Netherlands, and the Ottoman Empire, Philip maintained powerful Spanish armies and fleets around the continent. He was very devoted to the Pope and the Roman Church. Again, he wants to spread Catholicism wherever he goes, wherever his empire is. He used his great wealth in an effort to defeat Protestantism. He vowed to conquer the entire world for Spain and the Roman Church. He didn't succeed in that, but again, he came pretty close. His efforts to impose Catholicism on England and the Netherlands ended with the defeat of Spain's invincible Armada in 1588. This brought Spain's golden century to an inglorious end. The Spanish Armada, y'all probably have heard about that or read about that in history, but that really, what was behind that is Philip trying to conquer England and bring it under Catholicism. England had established the Church of England, Henry VIII had in 1534. Wanting to marry other wives, and y'all familiar with some of that. Wasn't pleased with his wife and wanted to do, so that's a pretty bad reason to start out the church. But anyway, so the Pope wants to bring them back under that yoke, and so using Philip to do that. But the defeat, in one of our U.S. history classes, we talked about this, something that U.S. history sometimes we forget, but this may be one of the most important things in American history, because had Spain defeated England, Virginia hadn't been founded yet in 1607. You wouldn't have had 13 colonies, you wouldn't have the Declaration of Independence, you wouldn't have the Constitution, so huge battle in history. But from a religious standpoint, used too. So again, it kind of helped halt to some degree the spread of Catholicism any further at this point. All right, let me see. All right, I'm going to skip some of that. But Spain's power, they don't become a weakling as soon as they lose to England, but from that point, you can trace a decline in their power at that point, the influence that they had as a nation. Okay, a couple of things real quick. that I'm going to try to finish here. The Protestant Reformation reached the Netherlands in the early 1500s. In the 1510s, Charles V had inherited the Netherlands from his Habsburg relatives. And Charles V plays a role in some things with Martin Luther that we'll try to share with you in a few weeks. Charles was not happy that the Dutch people were eager to accept the views of the Reformation. And the first two Dutch martyrs were burned at the stake in the year 1523. In 1566, Charles' successor, Philip, the same Philip we just talked about, issued a proclamation requiring all of his subjects to accept the decrees of the Council of Trent. In 1567, Philip sent in Spanish troops led by the cruel Duke of Alva. And again, to show you the mindset of the Catholic Church right here is what I'm trying to get at. Alva set up a ruling council known as the Council of Blood because of the brutal way it treated the Dutch people. About 8,000 Dutchmen were executed, and another 30,000 had their property confiscated. As a matter of fact, in 1568, the Inquisition condemned all 3 million inhabitants of the Netherlands to death. Now, that didn't take place, but again, that was their mindset. The entire country deserves to die because you're leaving Catholicism. And another thing to illustrate the lengths the Catholic Church would go to try to stamp out any divergent thinking, anybody thought differently, going back to France here for a minute, something called the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. I don't know if y'all have heard of this. To be honest with you, I don't think I had until I was teaching this a couple years ago in world history. Really, again, a very sad event. The St. Bartholomew Day Massacre in 1572, this was August of that year, during one of the unstable truces in France, was one of the most infamous events of the French religious wars. And again, in France, long story short, I'm not getting into all of this with you, but in France, the Reformation did take root to some degree. So the teachings of Luther and Calvin and others, they were open to beginning to question some things the Catholic Church was doing. And the French royalty kind of gave in on some points, but this shows, again, the lengths they would go to try to bring back Catholicism if they could. So hundreds of Huguenots. Now, Huguenots is a fancy name for just a French Protestant. So somebody that wasn't a Catholic in France. Had gathered in Paris to attend the marriage of Protestant leader Henry of Navarre to the king's sister. Catherine Medici, she was kind of the queen mother. 3 of her sons ruled as king in France. Convinced her son Charles IX, who was the king at that time, that Protestant leader Admiral Coligny was plotting against him. He was, again, an army commander there in France, and he was there at the wedding. Hey, Charles, this Protestant guy is out to get you. At dawn on August 24th, 1572, Catholic forces attacked their Protestant rivals while they were still in their beds, and the violence continued for 3 days. Nearly all the Huguenots in Paris were killed, including Admiral Coligny. Henry of Navarre escaped death by agreeing to change his religion. This is an interesting guy. He does this several times. So he says, I'm a Protestant. To keep from getting killed, he says, oh no, I'm a Catholic. Later on, he becomes king. He'll become king. No, I'm a Protestant again. And then when he didn't have all the power he wanted, okay, I'm a Catholic again. So he kind of waffled back and forth several times. It is estimated that 100,000 Huguenots throughout France were murdered at this one event. 100,000 at one event, murdered. Why? Because they didn't go along with what you're teaching religiously. Now, the reaction of this even, you think you would feel bad that 100,000 people got killed. Just the opposite was the case among Catholic leaders. Rome, when they get news of this, responded by singing songs of thanksgiving. We're thankful for the massacre of 100,000 people, and striking a medal to commemorate the massacre, a commemorative coin, I guess you will, for this massacre that occurred there. Pope Gregory the 13th and Philip II of Spain praised the King of France and hoped that the massacre was the beginning of a final solution to the Protestant problem. However, surviving Huguenots continued to fight in France. But I guess it's amazing that you'd have that type of reaction. You'd be happy that 100,000 people got killed to further what you... It's sad to me. Eventually, many of the Huguenots would be driven out by the policies of France and go other places. In 1685, over a century after these events, Louis XIV, who, by the way, as far as I know, had the longest reign of any European monarch. He was called in France the Sun King. He was the emperor in France for 72 years. So again, he began reign at the age of 5, had somebody kind of ruling with him, but long reign. But he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Now, this was a document that Henry, when he became king, gave the Protestants more freedom in France. But Louis XIV kind of revokes that, and he says this. So here's some of his policies. This is what he says in 1685. All Huguenot church buildings were to be destroyed. Any non-Catholic church buildings are going to be demolished. No public or private Huguenot worship services are allowed. So the Protestants, you're not allowed to worship at all in our country. Ministers, Protestant ministers who would not convert to Catholicism had to leave the country within 10 days to be put to death. He's trying to get rid of the Protestant leaders of the country. Children born to Huguenot parents were to be baptized by Romanist priests and raised as Catholics. Okay, you Huguenot parents, you have no say in the education of your child. We're going to raise them as a state, and they're going to become Catholic. Huguenots who were not ministers were forbidden to leave the country. I say, why would he do that? Well, the Huguenots had some wealth and so forth. They didn't want to lose those people that were good craftsmen and so forth. So that's the things he said. In spite of this, many Huguenots did leave the country. Many thousands, perhaps 500,000, fled France anyway to other parts of Europe and beyond. France lost all of these skilled Huguenot craftsmen, sailors, soldiers, and officers. Thousands fled to Berlin, Germany, which may have been the cause of the beginning of that city's greatness. Many came to America and made contributions to America's future greatness. But this point, again, we're trying to make is anybody that had the nerve to disagree with Catholic policy was dealt with very strongly in these areas. Napoleon, we're about to wind this part up. Napoleon claimed to be a son of the Revolution, the French Revolution that began in 1789. They got very, very violent. But Napoleon kind of came in and helped to stabilize some things at that point. He promised to promote liberty, equality, and justice. Taxes were collected by professional collectors, so there was a minimum of corruption. An efficient, highly centralized national government was established. Napoleon established new law codes, such as known collectively as Code Napoleon, the most famous law code since the days of Justinian. Frenchmen felt secure and enjoyed justice under their new ruler. Now, this is the part we're to get to. Napoleon made peace with the Catholic Church by signing the Concordat with the Pope in 1801, basically a formal agreement. The reason I'm bringing this up, again, I'm skipping some of the history right here, but during the French Revolution, a lot of the people revolting, one thing they revolted against was kind of the Catholic Church. But again, things with Napoleon kind of brought them back together to some degree. Religion to Napoleon was a tool, and he basically used it to get what he wanted to. In 1804, Napoleon requested that Pope Pius VII come to France. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in the presence of his wife Josephine and dignitaries of France and the church, the Pope declared Napoleon to be the Emperor of France. They actually say Napoleon got impatient waiting for the Pope to do that and grabbed the crown himself and put it on his head. But he gets the blessing of the Pope. I'm the Emperor of France. And from there, he pretty much conquered all of Europe in the next few years. All right, let me see. At the beginning, Europeans welcomed Napoleon's conquest because he was doing away with the last remnants of feudalism. He is promoting equality and the rights of man throughout the empire. They soon began to see him as an international tyrant. People became more attached to their own countries, and this growing spirit of nationalism played a large part in the fall of Napoleon. More and more nations wanted to be free from French rule. Spain revolted in 1808, which resulted in a long, bloody guerrilla war that the French ruthlessly and brutally suppressed. In 1809, Pope Pius VII, who had crowned Napoleon emperor, excommunicated him. So anyway, that's probably too much history that I shared with y'all there. But at this point, you see very much of a lessening of the Pope, not just in France, but in other countries as well. Not saying that people don't care about his opinion today, because they do. People still listen to what he says. But we see a long, long history of the Catholic Church and the influence that they exerted over some of the nations. Now, we've got just a few minutes here, and I'm going to start to share just a few scriptures from you. These scriptures are some that are given in the book by Alvin Jennings, Traditions of Men versus the Word of God. And so he believes that some of these passages are referring to the Catholic Church and to the Pope. I'll let you be the judge. When I read the book of Revelation, there is no doubt in my mind that Rome is the subject of that is discussed about the punishment of God. As it talked about in Revelation 17:9, the city on 7 hills, which is Rome, or 7 mountains. So, but is it referring to the Roman Empire, the Roman religious leaders, or both? And again, you can kind of make up your own mind. Revelation 10:1-4 says, and I saw, this was during the opening of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets here in that part of the book. And I, John, saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. And a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left upon the earth, and cried with a loud voice as when a lion roareth. And when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. Now, I don't know if this is the meaning of this passage or not, and if y'all have a different opinion, share it with me. But if you read B.W. Johnson and John T. Hines, their commentary of this book, what they believe is this is a prophecy of the beginning of the Reformation movement. The idea of the little book coming down from heaven, the idea of the Reformation leaders giving people access to the Bible again, unchaining the Bible. The 7 thunders, they say, was the Pope and his councils. Again, the city of Rome was called a city on 7 hills. And so the 7 thunders would be the Catholic voice being angry at Luther and others like that, and that John is told not to write the things that they say. I don't know if that's the meaning of that or not, but that's what John T. Hines and B.W. Johnson think. Okay. And we'll show you some other passages before next time. Thank you for your good attention.